Before you criticize King Arthur Legend of the Sword for not measuring up to the King Arthur you know and love, may I ask, which King Arthur is that? Are you referring to Nigel Terry's 80s Arthur? Clive Owen's attempting to be realistic but not really so much Arthur? Richard Harris's singing Arthur? Disney's animated Arthur? Or perhaps the Arthur referenced in the Mabinogion, which I'm assuming you've read in its original Middle Welsh, as we all have. It's nice light reading when you run out of Harry Potter books. Arthurian Legend has been adapted into countless books, plays, comics, and television series. But I pose the question, which is the best film version of King Arthur? Which film best captures the essential elements of Arthurian legend and portrays Arthur fully, with all his strengths and flaws included? To help you decide, I'm going to review and rate the best movies depicting the legendary British king, and in chronological order.
2, 5, Lisa, 3!
This doesn't include TV series, TV movies, or films that adapt Arthurian legend, but in which Arthur himself is not prominently featured. A special apology to all you 90s kids, because Quest for Camelot is not included for this very reason. So, let's begin on this quest for the greatest Arthur on film. First on the list is the 1953 adventure movie Knights of the Round Table, directed by Richard Thorpe and starring Mel Ferrer, Ava Gardner, and Robert, I refuse to even attempt an accent, Taylor.
There is shame upon my name.
The story begins shortly after Rome has withdrawn its legions from England. I know, from a historical standpoint, it shouldn't even be called England yet. But you history nerds are going to have to check yourself from here on out. There is very little in the way of historical accuracy in any of these movies, or the legends they're based on for that matter. Merlin calls a council between Arthur, his half-sister Morgan Le Fay, and her knight champion Mordred, during which Arthur pulls Excalibur from an anvil, signifying he is the rightful heir of Uther Pendragon and the king of all England. Naturally, Mordred isn't cool with this, and begins a campaign to defeat Arthur. But many noble knights join Arthur's cause and form the Round Table, including the all-American cowboy, Lancelot of the Lake.
The day is ours! Hail to Arthur, King of England!
When Lancelot unwittingly rescues Arthur's bride, Guinevere, she falls for his raw animal allure, and he for her feminine wiles.
60% of the time, it works every time.
To avoid his true feelings, Lancelot leaves Camelot to fight the Picts in the north, and takes a wife. However, Morgan Le Fay and Mordred hatch a scheme to bait Lancelot into returning to Camelot, and use his relationship with Guinevere to disband the Round Table and destroy Arthur's rule. On the positive side, Knights of the Round Table is a colorful tale with all the innocent charm that adventure movies of this era tend to have. There's a lot of action and battle scenes, albeit clumsily choreographed ones by today's standards. I could definitely see a kid in the 50s enjoying this as a double feature with Ivanhoe or Scaramouche, but if you're not so much into the golden age of Hollywood, you're going to find this movie basic and cheesy. Mel Ferrer's performance as Arthur is pretty wooden and glassy-eyed throughout.
What?
While Robert Taylor often looks like he's waiting for the scene to end so he can go hit up the local pub. Any of the details in the legend that might be a little distasteful, like Mordred being the product of incest, are not present, and the quest for the Holy Grail is only briefly mentioned as a sort of hobby Percival has. I understand this movie is a product of its time, but there are other adventure fantasy movies of this era that surpass it in pretty much every way. So, Knights of the Round Table only gets 2 Merlin beards out of 5.
What?
Next up, we have Disney's classic 1963 animated film, The Sword in the Stone, directed by Wolfgang Reitherman of Jungle Book and 101 Dalmatians fame. Unlike the previous entry, this story starts on Arthur as a scrawny little boy who hasn't yet discovered he is the future king of England, and is merely a squire for his adopted brother Kay. Of course, the wizard Merlin has foreseen Arthur's destiny, along with all future events, and decides to teach the future king the ways of the world.
Don't you get any foolish ideas that magic will solve all your problems. Because it won't.
After getting approval from Arthur's guardian Sir Ector, Merlin begins Arthur's education, which consists not so much of mathematics and essay writing, but more of transforming into various animal species to see how they live.
Jehoshaphat!
Aside from almost being eaten a few times, things go pretty well for Arthur, until he discovers the evil sorceress Madame Mim, who attempts to destroy him. Merlin battles Mim in a multi-species transformation war to save Arthur and his future kingdom. The Sword in the Stone was made during what I consider to be Disney's finest era of animation. The animation style is expressive, detailed, and simply a joy to watch. My homie Don Bluth was only credited as an assistant animator on this one, but still, I feel like you can clearly detect his influence in the character's movements. The musical numbers are fun, but don't really measure up to some of Disney's more memorable tunes.
Look for the bare necessities.
The only real issue I have with this telling of the legend is that it only feels like a first act with no follow-up. We only get to see Arthur as a boy and not as the king he becomes. It's a bit anticlimactic in that way, but still, this is one of Disney's animated classics for good reason, so I give it 3.5 rejected squirrels out of 5.
Round table?
Oh, would you rather have a square one?
Moving ahead a few years to 1967, we have the film version of the Broadway musical Camelot, directed by Joshua Logan and starring the original Dumbledore, Richard Harris, Vanessa Redgrave, and the original Django, Franco Nero.
The D is silent. I know.
This version of the legend picks up almost where Disney's animated film left off. Arthur is now a young man and having a panic attack in song form because his betrothed Guinevere is to arrive that day.
He's scared. Oh, he's scared.
After a brief misunderstanding during which Guinevere believes Arthur to be some random creepy guy in the woods, the two are happily married. That is, until the dashing Frenchman, Lancelot du Lac, arrives to join Arthur's round table and catches the eye of the queen. The relationship between Lancelot and Guinevere doesn't go unnoticed by Arthur, but he chooses to do the kingly thing and put their well-being above his. However, the affair doesn't go unnoticed by anyone else in Camelot either, and when a number of knights accuse Lancelot of treason, Arthur banishes them. Enter Mordred, played by an extra pompous David Hemmings.
And where the famous Lancelot? Or does he stand in between?
Mordred turns the fallen knights of the Round Table against Lancelot, forcing Arthur to sentence his true love to execution and fight his best friend. Camelot is the less well-received film version of a hit Broadway musical, but over the years it has become regarded as a classic movie musical in its own right.
Camelot. Camelot. I know it sounds a bit bizarre.
In terms of acting ability, Richard Harris easily shines above the rest of the cast. Arthur's anguish in having to choose either his kingdom or his wife and best friend is convincingly read in Harris's eyes, but there are times I wish he would dial it back just a few notches.
When we shall reach for the stars!
Still, Harris is one of the most compelling actors to have played the legendary British king, and that's not bad for an Irishman. Some of Camelot's musical numbers are very catchy and hard to forget, while others are somewhat forgettable.
C'est moi, I blush to disclose.
The film is also about an hour too long for my taste, and while 3 hours is standard for a play, it really wasn't necessary for this film version. I know it sounds a bit bizarre, but I give Camelot 3 out of 5 smirking Mordred faces.
I have won my battle, Pelly. And here is my victory.
Next on the list might easily be the favorite among all film versions of Arthurian Legend, despite the fact that it has very little to do with the legends at all. The 1975 film Monty Python and the Holy Grail, directed by the Terrys, Gilliam and Jones, is a farce of all the films I mentioned so far, and much more. The story begins with Arthur as a full-grown man, already on his quest to find the Holy Grail. What he lacks in a horse, he makes up for with coconuts. Just don't ask me how those coconuts got to Britain.
What? A swallow carrying a coconut? It could grip it by the husk. It's not a question of where he grips it. It's a simple question of weight ratios.
Various knights join Arthur's quest, including Sir Galahad the Pure, Sir Lancelot the Brave, and Sir Robin, the not quite so brave as Sir Lancelot.
Jacking it in and packing it up and sneaking away and buggering off.
After a brief stop at Camelot, they face various perils, including the knights who say "ni," killer rabbits, and worst of all, snarky Frenchmen.
You tiny-brained whappers of other people's bottoms!
If you do not open this door, we shall take this castle by force.
The Holy Grail was Python's second attempt to translate their television series to the big screen, and the first to use original material. A few elements from Arthurian Legend are used very loosely as the basis for the plot, but the film is a send-up of all fantasy and adventure films that came before it.
Now stand aside, worthy adversary. 'Tis but a scratch.
This film also gave Terry Gilliam his first turn in the director's seat, and in spite of the film's low budget, Gilliam's visual flair shines through clearly. Most of the Pythons play multiple roles, but because Arthur has the most screen time, he requires a bit more depth than his knights. And Graham Chapman does deliver some genuine emotion in this role while simultaneously being as hilarious as everyone else.
But You can't expect to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you. Shut up!
Monty Python and the Holy Grail is perhaps the most quoted comedic film of all time, so it should be regarded as the undeniable phenomenon that it is. However, considering it doesn't delve very deeply into actual Arthurian legend, or the character of Arthur, I will rate it 4 killer rabbits out of 5.
Run away! Run away! Run away!
Moving ahead to the radical 80s, we have John Boorman's 1981 fantasy epic Excalibur, starring a who's who of 80s British acting talent. Nigel Terry, Nicole Williamson, Helen Mirren, Gabriel Byrne, Liam Neeson, and Sir Patrick Stewart, among others. This story begins earlier in the Arthurian timeline than any of the previous entries, with Arthur Sr., Uther Pendragon. Uther has conquered all of Britain with the help of Merlin and Excalibur, the Sword of Power. But rather than having the film end in the first 15 minutes, Uther decides to screw things up by betting Igraine, the wife of his rival, the Duke of Cornwall. As a price for Uther's lust, Merlin takes the product of their union, Arthur, and leaves Uther to die in an ambush, but not before he secures the Sword of Power into a stone.
Nobody shall wield Excalibur but me!
Cut to years later, Arthur is now a young man serving as a squire for his adopted brother Kay, until he pulls the sword from the stone, revealing his true identity. By now you know the gist of what happens next. What differs in this telling of the legend from the previous versions is that it manages to cover far more ground in one film. It begins with Uther, then moves to Arthur as a young man, then the creation of Camelot and the Round Table, Arthur's friendship with Lancelot and his eventual betrayal, the quest for the Holy Grail, and Arthur's final battle against his bastard son Mordred.
Come, father. Let us embrace at last.
The quality of the acting is stellar. Nigel Terry does an excellent job in the lead role, giving Arthur the depth he requires through various stages of his life. Nicole Williamson plays Merlin a bit for comic relief, but it works.
A dream to some,
a nightmare to others!
While the effects are clearly dated at this point, the film contains hauntingly beautiful images in places. It manages to capture the glory of the legends as well as their dark and strange aspects. But Excalibur isn't without a certain degree of cheese either. John Boorman's most inspired creative choice was perhaps to set the film to the music of Wagner's opera Götterdämmerung. Wagner's music adds a kind of epic weight to the tale that no 80s composer could have lived up to. While it's not perfect, Excalibur may contain the most complete version of Arthur we have seen on film so far, so I give it 4.5 struggling Patrick Stewart faces out of 5.
One day, a king will come, and the sword will rise again.
And now for the final entry on the list, the last real attempt at King Arthur before Legend of the Sword, if you don't count The Last Legion, which I won't. 2004's King Arthur, directed by Anton Fuqua and starring Clive Owen, Ray Winstone, Mads Mikkelsen, Keira Knightley, and Stellan Skarsgård. King Arthur is the only film on this list that attempts to be even a little bit historically accurate. Of course, it is far from accurate, it's a Hollywood movie, but it does try a bit. The film opens with a group of young Sarmatians who have been called into service for Rome as auxiliary cavalry in Britain. Cut to a few years later, the Sarmatians are now hardened warriors, led by the half-British Arthur, and each sporting knightly names from Arthurian legend. The group of knights mistakenly believe their service to Rome is completed. However, they are given one final task, to go north of Hadrian's Wall into highly dangerous territory, and deliver a Roman family there back to Rome.
You coming? Of course I'm coming! Can't let you go any road! You'll get killed!
Arthur and his men find the family north of the wall, as well as a group of native Celts the family has imprisoned there, including the Celtic princess Guinevere. Guinevere leads Arthur to her father, Merlin, the leader of the Woads, a Pict-like people at war with Rome. However, Merlin offers Arthur an alliance against an even greater threat, the invading Saxons, who will soon be upon the knights and all of Britain. Despite Rome's numerous betrayals toward them, Arthur and his men decide to make a final stand against the Saxon army and save what remains of Britain.
I fight for a cause beyond Rome's or your understanding.
If you're at all interested in historical dramas about the Roman Empire, King Arthur is not a horrible watch. It at least attempts to imagine what Arthur might have been like if he was a real historical figure. The clashing cultures of Romanized Britons, Celts, and Saxons would have existed in this place and time, but probably wouldn't have looked quite like this. The Saxons in particular are portrayed as bloodthirsty killers without much depth or motivation other than to simply destroy everything in their path.
Killer.
To all the Anglo-Saxons watching this, no offense, but these guys are supposed to be you. The performances are competent but not exceptional, and there are a few decent battle scenes that will keep you entertained. Viewing Arthurian legend through a realistic lens is a pretty good concept, but this film doesn't quite live up to its potential. I give it 3 Roman Gladius Excaliburs out of 5.
It was my life to be taken!
So now that we've covered all of the best King Arthurs on film, you can make an informed decision as to whether or not Charlie Hunnam's new Arthur lives up to his film legacy. For me, Nigel Terry's Arthur in Excalibur is the clear winner. He portrays the depth and complete character arc that Arthur deserves. But who is your favorite Arthur? In the upper right corner of the screen, I've placed a survey with 5 options. Please click on it to weigh in. If you prefer a dramatized version of Arthurian Legend not included on this list, let me know what it is in the comments below, as well as your thoughts on Guy Ritchie's new King Arthur movie, Legend of the Sword. Until next time, when a king will come and the sword will rise again.
What?